Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed with part 2 of the March 2025 Q&A series. I think in part 1 I said there'd be like 8 parts to this.
You weren't lying, were you?
No, I never lie.
Okay, good.
So we're well underway.
We're going to be juicing this into the part 3 will be one question,
Yeah.
part 4 will be another question. It's what it's come to.
Well, we
now.
could do part 2, part 1 and 2, so we can split each part into sub parts and then really start juicing the content.
Somewhere we've got to make it happen. We promised it.
Yeah, so well underway with 8
abusing the
parts.
system is the best way to make it happen. People are still buying GPUs, so they're used to the abuse at this point.
That's right. Well, it's good for the YouTube algorithm, isn't it, to have juicier content like that? So anyway, let's get into it, but before we do...
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and the new Duranaut high-performance thermal paste. Duranaut offers extreme long-term stability combined with outstanding thermal conductivity, and this has been achieved through a specially engineered silicon oil combined with aluminium microparticles and zinc oxide nanoparticles of various shapes. Duranaut isn't electrically conductive and won't harden over time. For best performance, you'll want to apply a very thin layer, and to help with this, included is the TG Spatula Pro. The spatula's revised design allows for increased pressure during application, making it easy to spread a thin, even layer of Duranaut. So for more information, please check the link in the video description.
Ooh, love this question. Why do you think AMD was so intent to push the 9070 pricing to the last minute to the point that they spliced in the audio bytes of the pricing to the recording and left it out most of the slides? I was honest, I was really happy that people noticed the audio splicing thing because obviously as video makers, I instantly noticed that. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But it was good to see a lot of you guys notice that as well. So what are your thoughts?
Well, we saw leaked slides where they were prices were starting at $650, which we punched in some numbers, knew that was going to result in pretty weak reviews, pretty lukewarm reception. I know ultimately MSRP, does it actually matter? It does matter because there's the review reception, which becomes sort of the enthusiast reception to the product. And if everyone's saying it's a 7900 XT type product, yeah. I mean, obviously, initially, when it's anything you can buy, people are going to buy it. But the price was important, and it seemed like AMD wanted to be more in the $650 to $700 price range, which they said they were changing strategy. They weren't just knocking $50 off or whatever. But it seems like that's what they were going to do. And, you know, maybe that was on the back of stuff like FSR4 being greatly improved. So they thought, you know, maybe for some reason the old strategy would work, but we already know that that strategy wasn't going to work because they've tried it multiple times. So that's essentially why the price changed. I can't even remember, a lot led up to this essentially, but we had quite a few back and forths with AMD. It seemed quite clear to us that the price was going to be, I won't say, it was going to be higher than what it ultimately ended up being. They wanted a higher price. We were saying $550 would have been a price where it would have created insane hype. As the market conditions turned out, I think $600 probably was a fine price, and it worked well, evidently, given how the reviews and public reception, and then we'll have to see how things go forward from this point in time. But that's basically it. They wanted to charge more. Yeah,
I think it's kind of, it happens a lot in companies in this position, right? Is just second guessing of decisions. They're leaving it to the last minute because they're just genuinely not sure which direction they should go with. And honestly, it's better to leave something like pricing to the last minute and then making the pricing more appealing than going the other way and being really confident in a price that's bad. So if they'd set the price, I don't know, 2 weeks ahead of time when they were doing what we were thinking they were, you know, most likely going to do, set it between $650 and $700, and they would just confidently lock that in weeks ahead of time, it would have been a fail. It would have been a mistake to not have that flexibility. So, yeah, it seems like they had to re-record parts of the presentations. There was a lot of last-minute discussions and things. But, you know, we've talked a lot about how the Radeon division in particular has made some really baffling decisions over time. And so, you know, it's not surprising necessarily that they were potentially heading down another really baffling decision with something like pricing.
It is and it isn't, because they kind of came and said they weren't going to do that again. But
well, yeah,
true to form, though, I know what you're saying.
But I think with with this launch, in contrast to the previous launch of RDNA 3, there was a lot more discussion in the media by reviewers, people like us, but also in the community about what the acceptable price for this sort of product would be. Lots of speculation, lots of analyzing different prices for different levels of performance that AMD could offer. And so AMD was getting much more information this time around in a public fashion. You know, we were talking about it a lot in Q&As and podcasts. You would have seen the Gamers Nexus video about AMD not screwing up. And there was many content pieces like that being made. And so previously, it's possible that, AMD was sort of relying largely on their internal teams to come up with pricing and things. We've talked about how there's potentially been some issues there where they haven't fully understood the position their products are in terms of performance and things. I think with RDNA 4, they overestimated the performance of the 7900 XTX and XT models, and there are issues with Zen 5 as well. So this time around, there was much more information to go on. They could go outside AMD and get a lot of what I think is really fair and balanced opinions. And I'm not just talking about us, because I think we tried to do a fair and balanced job of our analysis of the situation, but there was lots of that from lots of different corners. And so, yeah, by leaving that decision until the last minute, they can look at all that feedback, look at the community feedback, and then make a more sensible decision. Whereas previously, without all that information, there's more potential for them to make mistakes.
And it's the best launch they've done in a long time. I think they did manage to get it right eventually. Glad they made those last minute corrections because, yeah, they got it right. And for all the people who were saying that delaying it was a disaster and this is another AMD fail and they've done the wrong thing here, which was pretty weird take at the time, I thought, because
and there's a lot. That was the overwhelming position.
Yeah, which to me seemed quite clearly that wasn't the case. And I hope now to those people who thought that, they realise that wasn't a bad move by AMD. Because look, if the 9070 XT was launched in January as planned, in fact, it was probably initially going to be a little bit before that, like late last year, I think was probably the initial target, and then sort of CES, and then it got delayed again. It would have been $700 US. As late as January, they would have gone with that pricing, thinking that was a good price compared to the previous generation, with the improvements they've made to stuff like upscaling and just where things were sitting and what they'd seen from the GeForce brand. So I think we would have got $700, and it would have been a pretty big flop at that price. Ultimately, in the face of no GeForce availability, they still would have sold cards, but it would have been more like, AMD fails again, this product's underwhelming, it's not great, which would have made more people reluctant to buy it, even without GeForce availability. And then as you get further into the product cycle, people just aren't interested in Radeon GPUs because basically everyone's saying they're not good and not worth buying, which is, again, what happened. Parts like the 7900 XT were discounted to the point where they were actually very good value towards the end of the product cycle, which is probably why AMD wanted to pick up pricing there around that $700 price point. But they weren't selling as well as they should have because there was that negative perception. And we spoke to a lot of retailers and they told us, because we thought if they can achieve a 20% discount, that's quite compelling given the disparity in features and all that sort of stuff. So we think that's probably enough to incentivize people to buy the Radeon GPUs. Didn't really turn out to be. It was like a starting point, I guess, where people started to consider it, but not overwhelmingly so. It didn't really sell in the volumes they needed to. When we spoke to retailers, they said at points, especially here in Australia, they did achieve a 30% discount. And whenever they achieved a 30% discount, Radeon GPUs sold like hotcakes. They actually sold well. And then as soon as it closed back up, like the 4080 Super refresh closed that back up to like 15-20%, the Radeon tap just turned off. No one was looking at them anymore. So 30% for last generation is where AMD moved good numbers. So that's what they needed to achieve. So that was more than what we even thought. And again, we can give our guidance and recommendations, but ultimately, what makes a 5090 successful at absurd prices is the people buying them.
Yeah. So
if people aren't going to buy a Radeon, at least for the previous generation, without a 30% discount, then there's nothing we can really do about it. So that's why we don't want I guess the only investment on our side is we don't want, just one horse in this race. we'll take the duopoly. That's better than a monopoly. So we want them competing to some degree, whatever that is.
Well, let's be honest. If the pricing of AMD cards was bad, this generation would have zero good options. And we didn't want that either.
Well,
we want gamers to have at least something they can buy that is some semblance of good value.
And it just becomes that much harder to revive the Radeon brand and have them compete again in the future. Like, hopefully this is a first step, because in my eye, it is a first step. Last generation, they went nowhere. They went backwards.
Yep.
So this generation, so far, so good. Hopefully they can continue that momentum. And then the Radeon 9000 series would be like a Ryzen type moment, if you want to use that analogy. Like, it'd be their first step at heading in the right direction. Hopefully they claw back some decent market share and the brand becomes relevant once again. And that's good for everyone. So that's really what we want to see happen. And I think if AMD had been left to their own devices, had their own way, wouldn't have been good. All right, Tim, this is kind of it is another crystal ball one, I suppose. Do you think it's possible for the PC hardware market to recover? Recently, with the price gouging and everything that's going on, it's looked really bleak, which you're not wrong about. Is it possible to recover?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've just had a really unfortunate compounding of factors over the last 5 years that has sort of meant that a lot of people are in this position where they're a bit disillusioned with the general PC hardware market. I think it's largely isolated to graphics cards. I think if you were taking a whole look at all the components that go into a PC, you'd find that pretty much everything outside of graphics cards has actually been pretty good. Like, products have been getting better and cheaper. CPUs are in a really good position now. So that is kind of a different scenario, but graphics cards are obviously a very important product. And, we've kind of gone from the 10 series being the last, at least in my opinion, really successful, available, good quality launch. We then went into the lackluster 20 series, then the good 30 series that you couldn't buy, then the lackluster 40 series, and now the super lackluster 50 series. And so there's been this, the only GPU generation that was like decent, you just couldn't get, which is really annoying, very unfortunate for people that happened. So, I think the key thing that goes into the PC hardware market being better, not crushing the spirits of gamers, is, do these companies actually want to make products for PC gamers? I think this has been something we've talked a lot about through this Q&A series, is Nvidia, for example, not really being all overly concerned about the gaming market anymore because of things like AI. And that's okay. We all know Nvidia's making truckloads of cash every single day from selling servers and that sort of thing. And all their presentations these days are servers, right? It's been up to the other companies, chiefly AMD, to actually decide, do we want to do things for gamers or not? And I think in previous years, AMD has been in this position where the answer should have been yes, but the products are saying no. So at RDNA 3, right, AMD should have been attempting to sell as many of those to gamers and doing what gamers want, but the actions were saying, we actually don't care about selling graphics cards. And so can the hardware market change? Yeah, by greater competition, by brands like AMD being competitive and looking at what gamers want and giving what gamers want, looking at their own market share and saying, that's concerning. Maybe we should be doing what gamers want. Intel making GPUs and actually manufacturing them would help, maybe. So doing those sorts of things. So, can it be better? I don't see a reason why, from a business standpoint, it wouldn't make sense for AMD to make products and make a more competitive market. We've talked so many times about how mind-blowing it is, some of the decisions they've made to make the GPU market less competitive, which has not helped with this scenario. So while I can understand why Nvidia is doing what they're doing, while I would love for them to be paid more attention to the graphics card market, fine. But AMD doesn't have that, let's make tons of money selling GPUs for AI at the moment. They should be focusing on gaining customers, making sure people are interested in buying cards. And just, as we've said, a sort of compounding of factors, different sorts of things have been happening. And just I feel like there's just a lot of bad luck, bad circumstances happening. Like, go back to the 20 series, for example. That was an underwhelming series, but it just so happened that the generation AMD had planned lacked high-end graphics cards. So it's like, how unlucky could you be that in between the 10 series, which is great and everyone wanted, and the 30 series, which at the time no one knew you wouldn't be able to buy one of those. But at that moment, AMD, that was the moment AMD decided to release the generation with no high-end stuff. And then later when you could buy graphics cards, that's when they do, like, just so many of these like unlucky, unfortunate, you almost look at it and say, what are these companies like colluding together to make this the worst possible market for gamers? But so, yeah, I mean, I don't want to sit here and say like, yeah, graphics card market's going to be awesome soon and everyone's going to be able to buy cards. But if AMD actually wants to turn things around and sell things, then yeah, it's going to be better for people. So let's hope. I just got myself an RX 9070 XT, and since it's becoming the norm to use these different enhancement technologies, I'm unsure which settings I should use. Should I go all in on everything that can be enabled or what? So I assume that this question is talking about AMD's plethora of various different things like Radeon Boost and Radeon Chill and super resolution and anti-lag and all that sort of thing. I feel like a lot of those features, maybe I'll annoy some AMD fanboys by saying this, it's kind of a lot of box checking things there, features that are just not overly compelling, but they kind of add to a long list of things you can put on a box. I don't know about you, but I feel like the really compelling features that you want to enable, obviously FSR4, which is a driver toggle, so make sure you're going into the driver settings and enabling that in the supported games. But beyond that, like, would I enable Radeon Boost? Like, probably not. Am I enabling driver-based frame generation? No. Radeon Chill, I mean, it's useful in some applications, but not for my high-performance gaming. Anti-lag, it's like, yeah, if you want. I mean, there's lots of stuff there, but at least for me, like, I'm going into and just using the super compelling things like FSR4, I guess. So, yeah, you don't have to turn on absolutely everything. And honestly, I think if you went in and you turned on Radeon Super Resolution and Boost and driver-based frame gen and all that stuff, you'd actually probably make your gaming experience worse. So start clean, start with all the features disabled, then start experimenting, seeing if you actually like those features, but probably don't turn everything on. At least that's the way I'd go about it.
Yeah, I've got the same opinion there. How far above MSRP is reasonable to pay for a better and or quieter cooler? Is it a fixed percentage, or does it instead vary on the price of the card and its neighboring products? Yeah, it probably depends on where it is in the product stack, but realistically, paying I don't know what percentage we put on it. You don't really want to pay much of a premium for these higher end models for the majority of gamers. I mean, some people like to have just the big, huge, giant graphics card because it looks cool and they can brag about having it. But realistically, if you care about maximizing your dollar, getting the best return on your investment, base model MSRP cards are generally pretty good. There have been instances in the past where they had like terrible VRM cooling or underwhelming VRM, but that is more of, it can vary from model to model. But typically speaking, base model cards, we've looked at them like a Ventus model, for example. I can't remember the last time we did this, but we compared some Ventus and Supreme models and it was much of a muchness. So you want to be paying a very small premium for those bigger, beefier coolers. Certainly not, I mean, let's say $600 MSRP card. I don't even think it's worth paying $700. Again, the current market, all of those rules just don't apply. But in a normal market where you can buy at or very near the MSRP, I think going from $600 for a Ventus to $700 for a Supreme, probably not really worth it. I mean, at that price point, maybe $50. $50 is probably worth.
Yeah.
They're not. Again, it's hard to generalize here because some base models can be quite loud, whereas the more premium model is very quiet. And that's not necessarily a specific GPU. It can just be the Ventus model for this particular GPU wasn't very good because they cut corners on the cooler or whatever, so the Supreme is much better. So you've really just got to research the base models and see whether they're acceptable or not and how well they work.
And there's base model competition. So it's not like there's just one base model. There's often each brand has got a base model, and hopefully at least one of those are good. But the way I look at it is in your $600 base versus $700 premium comparison, I sort of think, well, at $700, you're effectively saying $100 of that price is related to the cooling, performance, and design of the card. So what's that as what's $100 as a percentage of $700? It's like more than 10%, 15% or something. Just maths off the top of my head. Not 100% sure what the exact figure is. But like, is 15% of the price of the card actually justifiable for being just the cooler and the design? Because you have to factor in the actual performance, the features that Nvidia or AMD are providing, which is by far the most important aspect, is the actual gaming experience you're getting. So if you're saying that, even 10% of the value of the card is towards just maybe shaving 5 degrees off the core temperature and it being a little quieter, that's a huge percentage of the overall value of the card. Like, I would say that 90+% should be its performance and feature set as it's the primary thing that you're paying for. So yeah, it's really hard to justify those. $100 premium, I think, is a very large premium in my opinion. The $50 should get you a really good cooler. And
I agree.
You don't have to look beyond like the CPU cooler market, where the difference between a fairly entry-level air cooler to a really good, even AIO, is under $100 in a lot of instances. So you're not having to spend heaps for a good quality CPU cooler. So why is it that we have to spend $200 or $300 for these like 5080 premium ultra edition coolers? That's crazy. It's not even that high of a power consumption card to justify that sort of premium. And you're talking about $1,300 being like a base model 5080 in the current market too, which is just, anyway.
Essentially, if you're considering value, if that's the focus, which generally it should be, you really just want to buy the MSRP card that's not crap. So you want to research the MSRP models and buy whether it be a Pulse or a Hellhound if you're talking about Radeon GPUs, because generally those are pretty good. And you'll find that when compared to like a Nitro Plus, you're talking about a couple of degrees. And also with your GPU, it is more about the volume, because if your GPU hotspots 85 degrees or 75 degrees, it's really of no consequence to you. It's really about the operating volume. So obviously if the card runs cooler, stands to reason you can get away with a lower operating volume. But if you normalize them, for example, and one's 10 degrees hotter than the other, is it worth paying $100 to get it 10 degrees cooler? No, because again, it's really of no consequence to you.
It's delivering you the same performance.
It's usually well within safe limits. It's going to last just as long. So yeah, but again, such a difficult question to answer anyway, because it depends on what you're comparing. As to what you're getting.
The issue often is when you see those $100 premium models is that it gets very close to the price of the tier up card. Obviously, that's not the case with the 5080, but if you're talking about a 5070, for example, with a $100 premium slapped on it, that's more expensive than a 9070 XT. So those are things that have to be factored in for especially those mid to lower models as well, that these large premiums just make no sense, because you're comparing like a premium lower tier GPU with a faster base model card of the higher tier product. So, and in almost all situations, is way better to just spend the money on the base model, higher performing card.
Just check the review on that particular model, make sure it operates within satisfactory limits, and go from there.
Yeah. With the 5070 Ti and 5080 having GDDR7, do you think that as games get more demanding, that the performance gap between them and the RX 9070 XT will widen?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about it. So you've got about 40% more theoretical bandwidth with a 5070 Ti. It's plausible. We have seen in the more memory sensitive, bandwidth demanding games that the 50 series is more powerful relative to the 40 series than to expect based on sort of averages or what you see across other less demanding games. So there's definitely a bandwidth advantage there. Hard to say, because we've had HBM memory, for example, on stuff like the Fury X, and that, though they were limited by their VRAM capacities. That was problematic. So we never really got to see whether the additional bandwidth there would play out, because by the time we got more demanding games, they were exceeding the VRAM buffer because it was so small. So will that have 16 gigabytes? Probably, yeah. I mean, look, if we saw that in 2 years from now, I wouldn't be shocked that that particular model ages a little bit better. But because I can't think of any examples off the top of my head that I can point to and say, yeah, look, this has happened before with this particular matchup, and that made that one worth paying a premium for or a better value product.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, when it comes to VRAM capacity, it's a much more obvious thing that we can point to. So I'm not sure. It's definitely an interesting question. It's possible.
I mean, it's also possible that sort of GPU configuration will not really be memory bandwidth limited. Like it could have 40% more bandwidth, but a lot of that bandwidth just being kind of pointless because it's way higher than that card really needs to feed its cores or whatever. And then obviously there's latency differences as well. So potentially, and I don't really know what the G7 versus G6 memory latency is like, but we often see that bandwidth can go significantly higher with the new generation, but latency may only be improved by a lesser amount. And so that could also play into things as games become more memory sensitive. It's not just about feeding huge amounts of bandwidth, it's about how quickly you can access that memory.
Yeah, and I'm sort of making the assumption where the games where we are seeing the GeForce 50 series scale better than the 40 series, that it is to do with the memory, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the memory. It can be other architectural changes. So it's really difficult to say on that one. So basically, I don't know. I'm not super confident one way or the other. With AMD having a lot more stock on 9070/9070 XT launch, and it all pretty much selling out on launch day, can we say AMD has won the card launch game this time? Well, yeah, I mean, I guess they won by default, right? Because they had more stock.
Win by default. I mean, that's just a win, isn't it? Because if you're talking about the launch and one maker doesn't bother supplying the card and the other one does, I think that's just a normal win.
Sure, whatever you want to call. Well, okay, they won. Leading up to the release, I spoke with a few different retailers. They all told me the same thing. I heard from other tech media from around the world who spoke to their local retailers. They told them the same thing. Basically, the messaging was that the retailers had more 9070 series GPUs currently in stock waiting to be sold than all GeForce 50 series GPUs that they had managed to sell to date.
But hang on, Steve. Nvidia told us that they've shipped more 50 series cards than 40 series cards within the first 5 weeks. Are you saying that they were potentially misleading with that, and actually there's tons of these 50 series models out there?
Well, if that's true, that's alarming for them, because that means AMD is genuinely beating them and not by default, as I put it. That's what we were told. So yeah, we were told if either on the launch or shortly after, all of the inventory of 9070 series graphics cards at these retailers sold, or near enough to sold out, then yes, they will have sold more than all GeForce 50 series cards. And that doesn't include just the GeForce 50 series sales on launch day, but it means to date. So for some of them, it was like up to 2 months or something. So yeah, but I mean, it's because Nvidia is not targeting gaming at this point in time. So it's not like AMD's making more money than Nvidia. Quite the opposite, in fact. Nvidia is just not really looking to sell too many GeForce GPUs. So they're targeting other markets. We know what those markets are. So
yeah, I think there's even more factors than just the supply. I think AMD's done a much better job of pretty much everything. I mean, you look at the review reception for the Radeon models versus the GeForce models, and even before the Radeon cards came out, most of the GeForce models were reviewed negatively. So the positioning of the cards from Nvidia hasn't been great this generation. And then you just go into all the other issues that Nvidia's had, things like the power connector melting issue and all the discussion around, was that a suitable power connector? AMD's had none of that with their cards. The driver-related issues with things like black screen PCIe. Again, I think AMD these cards have been in many more gamers' hands, and we have not heard about some sort of widespread black screen issue or something like that, which has been an issue for AMD in the past. And it sounds like this generation, much more solid launch on that front. Obviously, there's then been things like missing ROPs. We've seen no missing hardware issues with AMD cards. And so I think AMD's done a really good job of executing their launch in terms of having supply, nailing reviews, making sure they didn't have issues at launch, and not having just some things that were easily solvable, like power connectors that everyone knew were already pretty dodgy, and then having the same issues crop up again. So I really think Nvidia is probably one of the worst Nvidia launches that we've seen when you assess all of those factors. They've done quite a bad job of launching a GPU, and maybe it's because they're focusing on other markets now, but I just haven't been impressed in terms of all of those things.
That's definitely all true. I think, though, if availability was a non-issue, then the discussion would be very different. And things like
it's a big factor.
What the retailers have told us, for example, wouldn't be a situation like if most people had access to a 5080 or a 5070 Ti, or maybe not a 5070, but maybe a 5070 at MSRP is probably a different. Like, I think the problem with the review reception is certainly by the time the 5090 was out of the way, and then it became quite evident with the 5080 that availability was a huge problem, and because of that, the MSRPs were essentially fake, as a lot of people were saying, which is fair enough. So I think if the availability was a non-issue and you could buy them at the advertised MSRP, then AMD would be struggling for this generation. I think the way things have been executed, they'd be at $600 for the 9070 XTI. I think they would be struggling much more than they are. And this is why price to performance has been such a big battle for AMD, and like we've talked about, they really need to be offering about 30%. I know, again, upscaling and stuff has improved, which changes that, but it doesn't necessarily change the perception from buyers. It might change our view on it because we've closely analysed it and come to a conclusion like we have in the past. But again, in the past, we thought 20% was very reasonable. Gamers disagreed. And again, it's so difficult for AMD to make these inroads because they're not just selling to someone who's come out from under their rock and been like, oh, I wouldn't mind doing this video gaming thing. I need a video card. What brands are there? AMD, Nvidia. Oh, okay, which one do I get? Not the situation at all. You're selling to a GeForce owner. Or in almost all instances, you're selling to someone who's bought a GeForce GPU. They were probably mostly happy with it, and they're probably really considering just buying a GeForce GPU again. So how do you convince them not to do that? It's obviously offering a certain amount of performance at a price point they just can't ignore, which we thought would be 20%. Evidently, it's 30%.
I think if they launched with more availability, they would have had better perception rolling through the successive launches. So if you could go and easily buy a 5090, then there'd be much more hype and interest for the 5080 because people are actually getting cards into their hands, and so on and so forth. People would actually be anticipating the launches because they know they'd be able to buy them for the advertised price. But the opposite happened, where I think each launch has been less interesting to gamers because you see the first launch, everyone's like, the 5090 is probably one of the better received cards, even though it wasn't received amazingly. But then you can't buy it. So then it goes into the 5080, and then, I can't buy that one. And then 5070 Ti, it's even worse now. So then why would I bother paying any attention to a 5070 or upcoming 5060 products? People have just... They've gotten into their heads at this point that the cards aren't going to be available at the advertised price, so why am I paying any attention? And so, I think you're right. If there was much better availability, that whole system would be very different. People would be interested and hyped by products like even the 5070, which I think still would have had negative reviews from you because of other reasons. But I think that product, we're seeing in Australia, it's sitting on shelves for very close to or even at the Australian MSRP. Not a great MSRP, but it's available at that price. And that's because of people just switching off from GeForce and then compounding, you get those negative views in about VRAM and things, and that doesn't help at all.
You don't want to... You want to give gamers what they want.
Yeah.
Gamers and backlash go together very well. You see it with games.
Gamers love a backlash.
They love it when a game gets delayed or it's launched, and in a lot of cases, fair enough. And I think what you're saying is accurate, and what I'm saying about the supply, because if you were able to buy your GeForce GPU, if you wanted a 5090, which I'm sure there's plenty of you watching now that would like a 5090, if you were able to go buy one, happy days. You're probably not going to get a melted connector. You're probably not going to have missing ROPs. These are more outlier cases. Again, I'm not sweeping them under the rug. I'm not defending them. I'm just saying the chances of you buying one of these cards. I'm a YouTuber. I was going to say I've got plenty of these cards, and I was like, well, I know how that's going to be received, but I have been.
You don't actually have plenty. You have a few.
Well, I have more than one.
Okay.
Yeah, we've seen 4 or 5 5090s. We've seen 3 or 4 5080s. I think 5070 Ti's. I've had 3. I've got 2 or 3 5070s. So I've got more 9070 XTs than all of those combined. So compared to what we normally get a lot of models, a more select range. But I'm hearing it from someone who's been trying to buy one.
Yeah, it'd be pretty annoying.
So I'm not trying to rub it in, but the point I'm trying to make is I have multiple models and we've not seen any of these issues. Not to say they don't exist. Not to say that you wouldn't run into it, but you're unlikely to. Now that I've given that legal disclaimer, my point is, if you could go buy a 5090 if you wanted one, or a 5080 or a 5070 Ti, hearing about this negative stuff with melted power connectors, it's more of the same. We've been there before with the 4090. 4090 owners don't care. It's like you only care about if it happens to you. Otherwise, you don't care. My 4090 is awesome. It's really fast. So you don't have a lot of these people who are upset and angry with the brand. But when you get a lot of people who can't buy what they want to buy and they're frustrated because they can't get it, and then they're hearing about missing ROPs and melted power connectors and Nvidia's poor handling of it all, then it's like the pitchforks and all that come out more.
Yeah,
so,
that's true. I think we've spoken about this in the past, that at least I believe that these launches are sort of beginning to hurt the GeForce brand in a way that, now that we've got competition from Radeon, things may actually have an impact. I think the seeds were sown a little bit with the 40 series, where we saw things like the 4080 16 and 12 gig. The 12 gig gets unlaunched because the reception was so negative. People really hating on products like the 4060 Ti 8GB and complaining about all sorts of other things in that series. The 4090 being the best card of that line says a lot, I think, for the general reception of that series. And then going from that into another generation where the cards have, quote unquote, fake MSRPs, they're not available, all sorts of these other issues. It does change the perception of people and make people more willing to accept other brands into their lives. You're talking about AMD having to sell largely to GeForce owners. Well, I think GeForce owners today are much more primed to move away from the GeForce ecosystem than they have been, because
not feeling the love from Nvidia at all.
They're not feeling the love. You're saying about Nvidia, or companies having to give gamers what they want, and Nvidia quite simply is not doing that.
Imagine being a gamer and saying, all right, $2,000 US, but I love my GeForce GPUs, had a great experience in the past with them. I'm a loyal Nvidia customer. I want to give you $2,000 US for your flagship GPU. And they're like, nah, we're going to sell that to AI for 3 or 4 times more. So you kind of like, where's the love there?
I saw the price of the RTX Pro 6000. It's like $8,500 US or something.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I mean, from a business point of view, they don't want your $2,000 if they can get, admittedly, it's slightly better bin silicon, but at the same time, it's 4 times the price. So, yeah. But anyway, it's just a crap situation there, and we'll move on to the next one. Do you think part of the hesitation with giving larger amounts of VRAM to lower priced GPUs may be related to Nvidia/AMD not wanting their data center customers to have a cheaper alternative to get a lot of memory/compute by just purchasing a lot of hypothetical cheap $300 to $350 16GB GPUs instead of investing in Pro cards?
Yeah, I mean, like, I could see this being true on a high performance card like a 4090, or 5090. Like, if they made a 5090 and let's say it had 64 gig of memory or something, then I'm sure that would be in high demand for those sorts of workloads. I just don't really see that applying to a 16 gig lower performing GPU. I think these days 16 gig is probably not sufficient for a lot of these workstation applications where they'd be after large VRAM buffers. It's just the VRAM requirements of workstation workloads have always been higher than gaming. So every time that you see, like, let's say the generation caps out at 8 gigabytes on the gaming cards, there's always a pro model that's 16 gig or more, and that's been the case every generation. So I don't think that 16 gig would. I don't see like a 16 gig 5060 flying off the shelves for AI workloads, for example, if it had 16 gig instead of 8 gig of memory. The RTX Pro 6000 series, the cards are like 48 gigabytes, 64 gig, 96 gigabytes. Those are really the memory capacities that people are after for those workstation models. And yeah, that affects the 5090 because it's a 32 gig card, but a 16 gig card, and on a model where the actual overall performance of the card is not especially high. I mean, if that card had 64 gig of memory, maybe, but 16 gig, yeah.
Yeah, there's probably been points at time where that's been a factor. I'm not confident it is now because the stagnation's been real for a long time. So we've gotten so far behind where the VRAM capacities need to be that these AI workloads and productivity workloads require so much more VRAM. I think at this point in time, it's just giving the more entry-level, mid-range gamers as little as possible and maximizing margins in any way possible there. Again, I think the 4060 sold really well. So although, we said it was a pretty crap product, even not that compelling at $300, I think it still sold really well. So that just signals to Nvidia do the same again. Why double our memory chip costs there and make the PCBs more complicated to produce? Just stick with 8 gigabytes and you're buying a cheap entry-level product. They've said as much to us as well when we've talked to them. It's a compromised experience because you're compromising on your budget. If
you peasant.
I mean, that's really it. That's the message. If you don't want a compromised experience, if you want to whack up the texture quality settings, if you want to truly be able to use ray tracing and those kind of features, then you have to spend more money.
Yeah.
Where they're essentially giving you a GPU that works, and it's like, it works. You've got to dial down some settings and make compromises, but you're getting a GPU that works at those price points. That's it.
I think this would definitely apply to, for example, if they made a 32 gigabyte 5070 Ti, so if they just doubled it from 16 to 32 gig, I think you'd see a lot more interest in that card from the pro market because you're taking
3D rendering and
stuff. Yeah,
stuff.
so that would be a really good card for a lot of workstation applications. $750 or however much it costs to double it, let's say $850, 32 gig, that would be a great GPU for those people. They want you to buy 5090s and pro cards instead, which is why 32 gig is segmented to the most expensive models. I think that's definitely something that's happening when it comes to this question. But I think, and you've made this point very clear many times, that it's about the upsell. The reason why you're not getting 16 gig on those entry-level models is to upsell you to a card with more VRAM. And that's just what they're doing. It's what they want. They want you to spend those big dollars. The 5070 Ti being it's $750 card with 16 gig. That's the minimum that you can spend right now for a 16 gig card.
Or 900.
Well, yeah. And I guess, there's rumors of the 5060 Ti having a 16 gig model, which may then become the cheapest adequate VRAM GPU from Nvidia. But there's been no real incentive or move to make a 5070 have adequate VRAM and those sorts of things. They just, and like you said, when we're talking to them at CES, they're just saying, yeah, we don't expect you to turn on all those VRAM requiring features. That's for people who buy 5080s and 5090s. And their points on that are very clear. That said, I do believe that this question, the answer to this would be very different if there was very strong VRAM competition. I think if you were seeing AMD or Intel providing 16 gigabyte affordable entry-level graphics cards, that Nvidia's 8 gig cards would become very unappealing in comparison. Yeah, they'd probably still sell well like a 4060 did, but the 4060 was competing against another 8 gig card. I think if that was a 16 gig model, you would start to see a lot more decisions being made to improve that VRAM, and suddenly all these excuses of, oh, it's just for, we want you to spend more, and we want to upsell you. You're not meant to turn on those features, and oh, we can't do 16 gig because it's so expensive to clamshell, and oh, those PCB traces are so expensive to put on the cards, and oh no, we can't do 16 gig on our entry level cards because of the pro market. I think a lot of those excuses would go away if AMD had a 16 gig entry level model and Nvidia would be like, we need to compete with that. Let's make a 16 gig version of the card. So yeah, that's basically how I see it. The pro market, yeah, I mean, I think the 96 gig version of that RTX Pro GPU, it's priced over $8,000 apparently. That's going to fly off shelves with that amount of VRAM. So yeah, the pro market, they want big VRAM buffers at the moment. All right, we'll hit pause on the questions for part 2 of this Q&A because we've got more parts coming up soon on the channel. So we're going to answering so many more of your great questions. And like Steve said in part 1, lots of great questions this time, especially from our Discord community who really stepped up. So if you want access to the Discord community, you want your priority access lane into asking Q&A questions, sign up and become a Patreon member. Then you get access to the Discord, hop in there, ask your questions, and often really like those questions from there. So yep, there's that. What else is our Discord? Not our Discord, our Patreon. What does that provide the people, Steve?
They get some behind the scenes content from time to time, a few little insights. Like when I went to the F1.
That's
I
right.
Lots of photos and videos. That was exciting.
You made everyone jealous by your attendance.
I went outside.
I know, yeah, it's crazy.
A brief foray into the unknown.
Yep.
I mean, it was the F1. It was a pretty safe environment for the most part for me.
Yep.
Had to get there though. It's like an hour and a half travel, so anything could have happened. But now we have behind the scenes content, the Q&A stuff, which we've already mentioned, and Tim and I get together just like this, but live, and answer your questions. Yeah. I usually just palm them off to Tim. It's easier and tell him to answer your questions. But on occasion, I attempt to answer a question.
That's where we drop F-bombs.
You drop F-bombs.
Have we? We might have once.
Tim's a bit of a potty mouth. Ask the members. They'll tell you the truth.
There's been a few rats on there from time to time, so it's probably been a few F-bombs. But anyway, if you want that stuff, monthly live stream is available for Patreon members, so check that out. That'll do it for this one. I'm your host, Tim.
I'm your host, Steve.
See you in the next one.